into typography, and it's one of my favorite modules that I like to go over. So even though we'll be touching on just the foundations, there is so much to learn about typography in itself, so we'll definitely share some resources after class for you to find out more if you're interested in learning more about that as a topic. Now, before I get started with this lesson, I wanted to see if there were any questions related to the module yesterday or the assignment related to the intro to color.
I had a question, Master. When we choose one, I chose one primary color. Can we choose more than one? I just felt like one was limiting. I don't mind having one and then going through the whole primary, grays, accents, and then have another color and do the same and merge them together. Would that work? Yeah,
so let's actually take a look at what I wrapped up yesterday with our assignment. So definitely, you can for sure use more than one primary color. If I take a look at our guided project from yesterday, in this example, I'm using a primary color for the button, and then for the background color, I'm still using one of the primary colors, but a lighter blue. So you can definitely feel free to explore and use other colors. And it's just a process of just trying out different things and seeing, what works and what's clear without it being overly distracting.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Nora?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Other questions about the module or assignment from yesterday? Okay, great. All right, so earlier this morning I posted a few things in Slack. So what will take place is we're going to go through a couple of in-class challenges. One is actually listed here in the Figma board that you all have access to. So please go in if you haven't done so already to add a page with your name. Just copy and paste this over. And as we review the in-class challenges, and even when we review the guided projects, I'll check in with folks from time to time. So just make sure you have something there, so that way we can talk about it in case I call on you. The second piece is the What Font Chrome extension. We'll be going over how to use that. And then for Figma users, in case you don't have local fonts downloaded, I have a link that was shared. And then as part of our guided project, we will be working off of these wireframes. And so this hopefully is looking familiar to you all. This was what Brendan had put together during the wireframing module. And if you have those available, pull it up. If not, that's okay. We still have, you all have access to these wireframes. So you can go ahead and copy and paste these over. And I'll talk more about, why I changed it up a bit. But go ahead, feel free to copy and paste these over or work off of what you have if you're working off of a different design toolkit. Okay, so let's talk about typography. And really, we have two objectives that we'd be going over in today's lesson. And the first one is explaining what typography is and why it matters, and then understanding the various elements of typography. So, if you've gone through Dribbble or sharedawards.com or other sites, it's really, really easy to find beautiful websites with these types of illustrations. And so here's an example from Epicurrents, which is actually a nature retreat / unconference for designers. But as we take a look at this site, can anyone tell me what part of this design is the most important to the overall UX?
The copy?
Yes, Serena, thank you. The copy, the content. Exactly. So if we were to remove all of that copy and all of that content, we wouldn't really have a site. We wouldn't really have a site to look at, and it really wouldn't truly be a website. It would just be a pretty picture that we see in front of us. So this is going to be really important for every product that we build. The most important part of our user experience is always going to be the content. And the way that we design content is with typography. And so what is typography? Typography is the visual component of the written word. A text is a sequence of words. A text stays the same no matter how it's rendered. And let's take a look at an example. So consider the sentence that we have in front of us that says, "Welcome to Utah." I can print that text on a piece of paper, or I can read it aloud, or I could save it in a file on my laptop, and it'll be the same text, just rendered differently. But if I were to take that text and print it, so here we have this billboard where it says, "Welcome to Utah," then this idea of typography gets involved. All visually displayed text involves typography, whether it's on paper, a computer screen, or a billboard. And each typeface is unique and are going to have radically different impacts on our content and on our designs. There are some typefaces out there that are going to convey a lot of personality that might be useful in communicating a brand identity. And then we have other fonts that are designed to be incredibly usable and easy to read. So some of those that come to mind are the fonts that Apple uses for their iOS designs, perhaps Roboto from Material Design. Those were intentionally designed for people who are creating experiences from a digital perspective so that it's easy for people to be able to read the content on those screens. But in order to use fonts effectively, we need to be able to understand how to talk about them and be able to describe their differences. So for the next few slides, we're going to go over some font terminology. These are examples that were pulled from canva.com, and these images are also available for Training Kit for you to refer back to if you have any questions. Now there's a whole dictionary of different types of typography definitions that we can go over, but we'll highlight some of the more common ones. And I would also encourage you all, if this is something that you're interested in, continue this practice, continue to read books about typefaces. You can even draw inspiration as simple as looking at magazine layouts and newspapers. The usage of typography is really everywhere. So it's really interesting to be able to apply some of the things that we'll learn today when you go out into the world and explore. Okay, so the first piece is the difference between a font and a typeface. And this is something that I've seen where these terms are used interchangeably, but there's actually a difference between these two. So on the left-hand side, we have a typeface, which is actually going to refer to a specific design of the letters. So think of these examples: Times New Roman, Helvetica. Even if you go to your design tool like Sketch, Figma, and Vision Studio, they will have a list of typefaces for you to select. Now, when we talk about font, a font is going to refer to a particular style or size of a typeface. And the examples could be 10-point regular, or 24-point bold, or Helvetica light. So if you're using a typeface, normally we'll see different styles. For example, in Roboto, they might have bold, light, italic. Being able to reference a particular style or size is going to represent a font. And to be honest, like I said earlier, these are used interchangeably. So for this lesson, we'll try to keep it to its original intent. We'll be calling typefaces and fonts, calling that out to its accurate meaning. But over time, when you're working with other designers and developers, you might just hear people just use the word font. And honestly, that's okay. So as you can imagine, we've adopted a lot of our terminology from printmaking. So in those days, fonts actually refer to the literal metal pieces used in a print machine, while the typeface referred to the bigger family of fonts. And Today, they're practically synonyms, but it's good to keep this distinction in mind. What questions do we have on the difference between a font and a typeface? All right. And just to add to this, thinking about how this is going to apply in the real world, the typeface that you select in the products that you're building, even when it comes down to your portfolio or even your resume, they're all going to influence some type of emotion in the person that's reading it. So some things to keep in mind, make sure that whichever typeface that you're selecting, that it's readable. Sometimes there are really, crazy fun typefaces that are out there, but we always have to think in context of our users. And what we'll do next is go over all of these different types of elements of a typeface. So the first is a character. And a character is basically going to be an individual symbol of the full character set that makes up a typeface. These examples include the individual letters, individual numbers, punctuation marks. So pretty self-explanatory. Any questions on what a character is? All right, so moving on to this next piece, we have, oh, sorry, was that a question coming through? All right, we have serif and sans serifs. So if we take a look at the image on the left-hand side, a serif is going to be a short line or stroke attached to or extending from the open ends of a letter form. This also refers to the general category of typefaces that have been designed with this feature. And then meanwhile, we have a sans serif, which is the general category of typefaces designed without serifs. And as we start learning typography, this is one of the easiest distinctions to pick up first. So the biggest difference between these two is just the use of its embellishments. On the left-hand side, we see these extra little features attached that we can see in orange. And then in our sans serif, there are no embellishments. So if we were to take a typeface like Times New Roman, where they have those little extra details, that would be considered a serif. And then a good example of a sans serif that we've used this week is Roboto, which is Google's font. That would be a typeface that does not have any embellishments and therefore would be a sans serif. What questions do we have about serifs and sans serifs?
So with all typefaces, you can categorize them in just these two sections of serif and sans serif?
In its most basic form, yes. I believe there are other categories that I'm actually not too familiar with, and we might see them when we go into fonts.google.com. But when it comes to typefaces, just stick to serif and sans serifs.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions related to this? Cool. All right, so next we'll move on to italics. And italics refers to a slanted version of a typeface. So slanting from left to right. And a true italic is uniquely designed more than a tilted version of the upright typeface. So what they're really saying here is if you were to, let's continue to use Roboto as an example, there are styles that you're able to select in your inspector tool. And one particular style would be being able to customize that Roboto typeface into an italicized version of it. But there are actually typefaces out there that represent a true italic, and so those are going to be actually personally designed. Now, in this example, it actually illustrates the difference between just an italic and a true italic. So on the left-hand side, we have a typeface where the style has been customized to be italic, and then on the right-hand side, we have something that is actually uniquely designed to represent that tilted version, that italic. What questions do we have about this?
So how often do you see true italic?
I don't, not very often, only because when it comes to designing user interfaces, I haven't personally gone out to search for something that's the true italic. Quite honestly, I would just modify what I have. But in true typography terms, this is what it really is supposed to represent.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions about this? All right, so moving on to baseline. Now, these next few elements that we'll discuss will relate to more so to spacing, spacing related terms. So the first one here is a baseline. And a baseline is basically this imaginary line where most letters and other characters sit. If you actually go into Figma, when you type out a piece of copy, and we'll get to this later in our guided project, but they will actually insert a baseline for you so that you're able to see where that is. And baselines are also very useful when you're using, let's say, a layout with grids. So that way you can make things aligned properly. So what questions do we have about baseline? All right, so next we have our cap line, which is basically going to be that imaginary line that marks the upper boundary of capital letters and some lowercase letters, some lowercase letter ascenders, which we'll get to in a bit. So like we saw previously, that white dotted line on the bottom is going to be our baseline, and then our cap line is going to be that blue dotted line. What questions do we have about cap line? All right. So this next one is called an X height. And this is going to refer to the height of a typeface lowercase letter. So in this example here, we see the lowercase letter E. And so the X height is going to be the distance between the top of the red dotted line that will sit on top of the lowercase e and between the lower red dotted line that sits below towards the bottom of that letter E. This is also what we use to distinguish between ascenders and descenders, which again, we'll talk about that in just a bit. And generally, when it comes to X heights, the larger the X height, the more readable it is. So for part of our assignment this afternoon, you will be going into fonts.google.com and you'll be exploring two different typefaces and doing a comparison or being able to contrast between those two. And so you'll be able to notice that difference if you pick something that has a super small X height versus something that has a little bit of a larger X height. So what questions do we have about X heights? And I will say, you know, if you're seeing this for the first time and you've never learned about typography, some of this is going to seem really foreign. It definitely did for me. But over time, the more that I took the time to understand these different typefaces and how they were designed differently from one another, all of these definitions that you're seeing will come naturally to you. This next piece, so we're getting into our descenders and ascenders. And if we look on the left-hand side, our descender is going to be a piece of letter that extends below the baseline. So we were just talking about this baseline that sits below the bottom of our text. And so that descender where you see that yellow fill, is extending below the baseline. So that is going to be our descender. And then we have our ascenders on the right-hand side. And that is going to be a part of a lowercase letter that rises above the main body of the letter or above the X height. What questions do we have about descenders and ascenders?
I had a quick question. So you know how you usually have a dotted line for everything? How come there's none for ascenders and
No dotted line for ascenders and descenders?
yeah, just to sort of yeah, just to showcase where they end or begin. You know how you had some for like a cap line? So,
Yeah. Yes, Navia. So that's a really, really good question. So the way that it's set up here, and from my understanding, is the way that we would differentiate the difference between a descender and an ascender. So a descender would be differentiated by its baseline. So anything that would extend past that would be a descender. And then in terms of the ascender, anything that would go, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the cap line, that would be the X height. Anything that would go past the X height would be considered an ascender.
that wasn't my question actually. My question was like, you know how you have this line right here? You know, how come there's not one for this part that lets you know that a descender cannot go past this line, like a limit line?
Yeah, okay, thank you for clarifying. And I love that you were able to draw on that. That's awesome. So that is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure if there's even a defined rule based off of that. I haven't seen in the past where there was a defined set of guidelines that would say that the descender or ascender would extend past a specific point, but I'm happy to take a look and get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, let me just write that down. Okay, great question. All right. So moving on to the,
It's called the beard line.
the beard line.
Yeah, the line that the descenders come down to, it's called the beard line. I knew it existed because I've taken typography before, but I couldn't quite remember, so I had to like look it up real quick. But yeah, it's a beard line.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Huh?
That's awesome. All right, there we go, a beard line. And I noticed that Ash had also suggested some resources as well, and that actually goes beyond the glossary, these terms that we'll be discussing today, so feel free to take a look at that. Awesome, mystery solved. Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, so we were just at descenders, ascenders. Okay, so next we have tracking, and tracking is going to refer to the uniform amount of spacing between characters in a complete section of text. So a complete section of text would be a sentence, a line, a paragraph, a page, etc. And in this example, we see the differences in tracking between what it would look like when it's set to normal versus what it would look like when it's set to tight, and versus what it would look like when it's set to loose. So if you were just to take a minute and actually try to read all of these sentences, you may notice that some of them will be easier to read compared to others based on the amount of tracking. So what questions do we have about tracking?
I have a quick question. Which one of these is supposed to be the easiest for people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say, just based on the typeface that I see in front of me, I would say that the normal would be the easiest to read. The tighter version and I think we can all do this exercise together. As you try to read it out loud to yourself, you may find that you get distracted by the letters that are touching one another. And then in the looser version, again, you might have that distraction where the characters between each other have a little bit more spacing. So I would say that the normal would be the most readable compared to the other two. Other questions on?
Is there an instant where, sorry, is there an instant where you would prefer to use the tight over the loose over the normal? Like, does it happen? If normal is the easiest one to read, why use the other ones?
Yeah, that is a good question. So that is going to vary depending on the typeface that you choose and how it's and what you're designing. And so typically we're going to get into kerning in just a bit, which is going to be the spacing distance between the individual characters. But what I've normally seen is with designs that are using uppercase letters, there might be more of a looser tracking between them. And I found that easier to read in comparison to normal. So it's going to be a case-by-case basis depending on the typeface that you choose and whether you're using uppercase or all caps. So there's many things that come into play. So just because the normal version right here seems to be the most readable, it is still going to be a case-by-case basis. Does it answer your question, Nora?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Great questions. Okay. So this next one is kerning. Whereas tracking refers to the uniform amount of spacing between a group of letters, kerning is going to refer to the horizontal spacing between two consecutive letters or two consecutive characters. Adjusting the kerning creates the appearance of uniformity and reduces gaps of white space between certain letter combinations. And typically when it comes to using typefaces that are already in our design toolkits, we won't necessarily need to adjust for kerning because that is something that the typeface designer will already account for. And so this is a good example from things that I've seen in the past where Spotify in some of their interfaces, I think it's with Spotify or maybe it was Envision, but they use uppercase letters to indicate like a section. And I've noticed just by trying to copy their work and understand their thought process is that they'll focus a lot with these uppercase letters. They'll make sure that there's enough kerning between all of these to make it more readable. So that is something where I've seen this get adjusted. What questions do we have about kerning?
Unless we are designing our own font type, face type, what is it called?
Typeface.
Typeface. We don't really have to worry about these angles, right? They just they're preset.
Yes, they are going to be preset. I would say the most important piece that we'll be touching on that will apply to your Build Week project is we're going to learn how to build a typographic scale. So all of these little elements that we're touching on, that will already be taken care of in the typeface that you select. But I would say generally over time, it's still good to build upon your typography skill set. There are some design roles, not all, where folks are really interested in having designers who are familiar with this terminology so that they're able to talk about it. But chances are, unless you're a typeface designer, you don't need to worry about every little thing that's being shown here. It's just
that. I've noticed a phenomenon, at least when I was designing like posters, in that a lot of times the presets that the typographer has created are made assuming that people are going to be using like the smaller defaults. So if you just have a regular like 12 to 28 point font, you're going to be fine. But sometimes with larger headings, the spaces don't work anymore. Like things become larger in weird areas, and then you have to pay a little bit more attention to the kerning because the defaults might not be working in that scenario, in my experience.
Yeah, that's awesome, Kelsey. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so these are all good things to think about as you're putting together your mock-ups. Awesome, thank you. Okay, and then the final element is leading. So leading is going to be the vertical spacing between lines of text from baseline to baseline. So we have normal leading all the way to looser leading. And again, this is that vertical spacing between baseline to baseline. This, I will say I have modified in the past based on my designs. But when it comes down to working in design day to day, all of this is also going to be driven by the style guide that you're working off of. You might make minor tweaks, but there really shouldn't be too much. That should already be defined. But if, thinking back to our scenario yesterday, if you are the sole designer and you're creating a style guide from scratch, these might be things that you'll have to pay attention to. But most of the time we can just use the defaults that we have. So what questions do we have about leading? Okay. So like I said earlier, there are far more terms that are out there, like the one that Kelsey mentioned earlier about the beard. So these are the basics of the ones that I've seen frequently used. And I don't expect all of you to memorize every single element. I did not memorize everything when I saw this for the first time. So this will take time to build your vocabulary, and it's also exploring different typefaces and getting familiar and understanding the differences between them. But as you continue to work in your designs, or when you are building your portfolio and building out your resume, the typeface that you choose and how you're defining that is going to make a really big impact to whoever is going to be looking at it. So we need to make sure that we're always thinking in the context of our users, that we're not picking something that is not very readable. And through time, you'll be able to get comfortable in what would be a strong typeface to use depending on the project that you're working on. So I want to show you one example, another resource to help you build upon your vocabulary if you're interested. And some of you may have seen this. Let me get this up. Where'd you go? Okay, and I'll copy and paste this into Slack. And this is called TIFF. So this could be a useful tool for you all for your afternoon assignments, where you're able to go in and take a look at the differences between two different types of typefaces. And here, you can pick your first one, which is, we'll just leave as Georgia, and then maybe we can pick something else that is more of a sans serif.
Are you sharing your screen?
Oh, I am not. Serena, thank you.
No problem.
All right, here we go. Can you all see this? Cool. All right. So this is the tool TIFF, and so you can actually come in and pick out two different typefaces and do a comparison. So the first one that we have in blue is Georgia, and the other one we have is Roboto. And if you actually click on sideways, you can see the differences between the two. You can also overlay them, and that way you can see, for example, Georgia has these extra embellishments that is seen in a serif, and then we have a more a Roboto font that doesn't have that extra embellishment. So this is really, really awesome to take a look at from time to time. Another really great tool to use is what font, which is the link that I had shared with you all. So if we were to go to, let's do Airbnb. And we can go into their design site. All right. So if I were interested in knowing what type of typeface this is, once I've downloaded the What Font Chrome extension, I could click on this. You'll see exit what font, meaning that this is now working. And so if I were to highlight over these guys, we'd see that they're actually using something called Serial. And if I were to click on a specific section, we could see the size and the line height, as well as the color that they're using. And from time to time, what I'll do is if I'm interested in learning more about that specific typeface, I would just go in, search for Serial typeface, and I'll scroll through. Oh, but even here, awesome. So Product Hunt has an article about this typeface and how it was created and the history behind it. And so that gets really interesting just to understand, you know, all of this thought process that went behind it. Now, the other tool that some of you may already be familiar with is google.fonts.com. All right, let's just Google Fonts. All right, so Google Fonts. Let me go ahead and paste this into UX7. Google Fonts is another tool where these are all open source for you to download and use. And if you are using Figma, I had shared earlier with you a tool that you can install, and in that case, all of these Google fonts should be available for you to pull in Figma. But what's really nice about Google Fonts is you can go in and you can actually specify by category. So there was a question earlier, you know, is it just serif and sans serif? So these are other categories that are also listed. Display, handwriting, monospace. Those I haven't explored too much, only because I'll stick with these two when it comes to picking a typeface for my mockups. But when you go in later, you're able to deselect, pick something that's a serif and sans serif. You can also pick the number of styles. So for example, if I wanted to have a typeface that had 7 or more styles, I can predefine what that would look like. And as I continue to go in, let's say we were interested in learning more about Source Sans Pro. I could see who created it, what it's all about, all the different styles attached to this typeface. I think this is pretty new. Countries where it's most popular, a number of times that it's been used. And then you can go in and see an example of what it looks like. And if you were to download it, you would just click on this plus button and download it through there.
So I had a question actually pertaining to Figma and their fonts available. So when you click on the drop down for whatever font you want, is there a way that you can see an example of what it would look like as opposed to it all being the same face type right now?
So you mean as I scroll for it to like update simultaneously to preview?
Well, not necessarily in preview, but just in this drop-down menu alone. You know how if you're in Google Docs and you do a drop-down and you're looking for a font, a typeface that, you know, you can actually see it within the Google Doc immediately to get an idea of what it looks like versus this.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I have not seen a feature yet where you're able to view what that looks like while you're scrolling. In my experience, I've just had to go in and click through, or the easiest thing for me is to start with Google Fonts and see what I like and then use that.
Basically, that's what I'm doing now. And
Yeah.
but time suck.
It's hard. It's really hard to find something and then actually take a look at it in your design. It takes work.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Any questions on the tools that we were just looking at? The What Font, Chrome extension, TIFF. Oh, this was one of the resources that Ash had shared earlier. So if you want to learn more about these extra elements, we have something called a vertex, a terminal. But any questions on, and this was another resource she had shared, but any questions on any of the tools that we've just gone over before we go into our in-class challenge?
You said you had shared like a plugin for Figma earlier, but I don't seem to see that. Would you mind resharing it?
The plugin for Figma.
I don't know if it was a plugin, but yeah, you said it was a Figma resource.
Yes, this guy here. So let me just pull up Slack. It will be this one here. And then that way, once you download this, you should have access to all of the Google Web Fonts.
Oh, sweet. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. All right, so let's dive into our in-class challenge. And for the next 5 minutes, go to fonts.google.com and find a typeface and just list out a couple of bullet points on how you would describe its elements. So let me share this in the channel. All right, so I'll put some music on and put 5 minutes on the timer. Any questions before we get started with that? Cool. Okay, so let's take a look at what folks have. All right. Who have I not heard from? Miguel, would you like to showcase what you have?
I'm completely not done yet. Do you mind coming back to me?
Yeah, that is no problem. All right. All right. So, Alan, is there something that you would like to showcase? Alan, I don't know if you're there or if you're on mute. All right, well, third time's the charm. Serena, would you like to showcase what you have?
Sure.
Thank you.
Here we go. All right. So I chose Playfair, and I really like that you can read up on, what this designer was inspired by. And when I saw it, I thought, oh, it looks kind of like Times New Roman. And then I felt that it is a serif font because it has like these little fancy additions to the top and bottom of each letter character. And what else can I tell you? I think it has a pretty average ascender and descender. It's not too long. It's not too short. What else? What are some other terminologies I can use here today? Tracking. Let's see, what can I say about tracking? Of course, can be adjusted throughout. But it looks kind of tight. Like it being a standard. If this were the standard style, I think it looks a little tight. It's not that spaced out. So yeah, I guess that's much as I could say right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Serena. Yeah, so when we're referring to the individual characters and the spacing between, we can refer to the kerning. And so, yep, the kerning. Awesome. Okay. Miguel, looks like you're all ready. Cool.
All right. Give me 1 second. So the font that I picked was Roboto. I've been using Roboto ever since day one of Lambda. It just really suited me. It's been the main font for Android's mobile operating system since 2011. It is a sans serif typeface. As you can see here, it is very, very easy to comprehend. Reason being why Android uses it for its operating systems. And it's very open and I would say friendly. It's very, like I said, it's very comprehensible and it's very regular at the same time. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for Roboto. It's one of my favorite fonts, actually.
Awesome. Thank you, Miguel. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Awesome. Great job. So let's do this before we talk about text hierarchy. Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, welcome back, everyone. All right. So what we're going to do for the second half of this lesson is talk about text hierarchy. So just make sure that you have access to the Figma board because we'll all be using that to work on our in-class challenge. And that link was posted in the Slack channel earlier today. And then after that, we'll work on our guided project and we'll create a typographic scale. And if there's enough time, we'll make the changes in the guided project flutter that we all have been working on. Okay. All right, so moving on to text hierarchy. While a good typeface goes a long way towards improving your typography, the most important aspect of your content is going to be your text hierarchy. And we're pulling this quote from Jeremy Lloyd, who's the creative director of Sparkbox. And Jeremy explains, typographic hierarchy is a system for organizing type that establishes an order of importance within the data, allowing the reader to easily find what they're looking for and navigate the content. It helps guide the reader's eye to where a section begins and ends, while enabling the user to isolate certain information based on the consistent use of style throughout a body of text. So what does this all mean in practice? So you may have heard of this term text hierarchy, but if you've ever read a newspaper or a magazine, then we should all be familiar with it because we've seen it before. And here's an example from the Wisconsin State Journal. This example is actually pulled from canva.com, but this is showing text hierarchy at work. We can see that this newspaper is using strong text hierarchy to emphasize the most important information first. So the most important information is that headline that's highlighted, which is on the moon, which is being treated as level 1. Then as we gradually go down and scan the page, we have our second most important piece of information, which is going to be our subheader, a giant leap for all of mankind. And then as we continue to scroll down, we have our body text, our level 3. And taking into consideration text hierarchy is going to really help enhance readability and usability. And this is going to come through when we begin working on a typographic scale towards the end of this lesson. Another good way to look at this too is if you are, let's say you're working on a mock-up and you're really unclear whether or not it's conveying text hierarchy. There's 2 methods. If there's enough time, I'll show the second one. But the first one is actually just stepping back and just doing a squint test. So squint your eyes. Normally, if you squint your eyes, you'll be able to see the most important information that is being presented. Number 2 is there's a way where if you were to paste over a white blurred background, you would also be able to see what is going to be the most important pieces of content. So when you're all working on your mock-ups, text hierarchy is going to be really, really important so that you're guiding the user through your experience. And here are some examples. So the importance of text hierarchy is going to be immediately apparent when you look at text that is missing one. So in the first 2 examples, the first one being no hierarchy and the second one being limited hierarchy, we have a really hard time distinguishing the different parts of the content. We have a hard time seeing the important details, and if you were all looking at this for the first time, you might have a really hard time understanding what the content is all about. Even as you're looking at the page, your eyes just might be scrolling all over the place because you really don't know where to focus your attention on. But as we continue to gradually move on to the other 2 pieces where it says improving and much better, as this text hierarchy improves, we're able to quickly scan the text and understand more about it. So at this point, at improving, maybe I even have limited hierarchy. I can see, my attention draw towards On the Moon. Then because the subtitle is italicized, I'm able to see a giant leap for all of mankind. But then as I continue to scroll down, it's just a bunch of text, and I'm not able to really differentiate it from On the Moon and a giant leap. But as I continue on to improving, all right, so we've noticed a couple of different things here. Everything had been left aligned in the first two examples, but in the third example, we have On the Moon, which is now bolded and centered. We also have a giant leap for all of mankind. It looks like that has also been bolded, and they might have also increased the text size. And then now we're able to read Americans First to Walk on Dead Lunar Surface, which is bolded. And it looks like that that font may have also increased in size. Then we get to a much, much better version, very similar to what we saw in the previous example, where On the Moon is big, it's exemplified. The text size that we're using is much larger in comparison to all the other sections. And then gradually, we're able to read, distinguish between the two, are all of these different pieces. You'll also notice that spacing is involved, where everything felt very, very squished and no hierarchy. In comparison to the last view, we have spacing to indicate the different sections. So I want you, whenever you are working on your mockups, to think about text hierarchy. It is going to make a tremendous difference in the designs that you'll be creating. So like I said, ensuring that your interfaces have a strong text hierarchy is an incredibly important part of the design process. As you can see here, as the text hierarchy improves, we can quickly scan the text and understand so much more about it. Without having any sort of text hierarchy, your users won't know what information they need, or they won't exactly know how to interact with that experience. So what questions do we have about text hierarchy? Part of this exercise is also building your eye out for visual design. I know when I first started working in design, I never noticed things like this. I would say, okay, well, that's just a newspaper layout, or that's just a bunch of text. But when I think about it some more, and when I've practiced this, and when I've practiced this skill set, I've noticed that how you're structuring things makes a really, really big impact, and it really, you're really influencing how that user's viewing your page. So let's actually move over to an in-class challenge. And all of you should have access to this. If for some odd reason you're having a hard time getting to this, let me go ahead and just copy and paste this. I think I have it available. I'll copy and paste it in the Slack channel. So there's, you might all already be familiar with this, pulling something from Green Eggs and Ham, Dr. Seuss. But you all should have access to this board that you're able to copy and paste in here as well. Awesome. All right. You all are on it. Love it. Okay. So for the next 5 minutes, you are going to improve the text hierarchy in this example. And I want you to think about size, text size. I want you to think about weight. I want you to think about alignment. I mean, should this really be centered? Would it look better if it was left aligned? I want you to think about all these little pieces, so that way, if anyone were to take a look at this bunch of text, that they would be able to squint their eyes and be able to see order to that. So what questions do we have about this in-class challenge before we begin? Okay. All right. So I have uploaded the challenge into Slack. I'll put on some music, and we'll spend 5 minutes rearranging the text hierarchy.
angels.
timing. Okay. So let's do something a little bit different here. I am going to share my screen and share what everyone has worked on. So I'm just going to scan through, and then I might have questions based on what you've put together. So let's begin with, this was our original exercise. So some things that I had intentionally done here is there is definitely freedom for you all to play with the typeface, the size. So my goal originally was to create something that just didn't represent any type of text hierarchy, just a bunch of random text. So I wanted to point out, Josh, I'm going to showcase yours. So could you just walk me through your thought process when you put, as how you put this together?
Yeah, sure thing. So as I went through this, it felt like everything was just kind of bunched together. And so we do have here the title that's important, and so we want to make that bold. And then also the author would probably like credit, so I made that a little bit larger as well. And then it looked good to just have everything centered to me, I guess. So I just put everything in the middle of the page. And then the text itself, it felt like a conversation. So I thought it would be fun to kind of just put it to the left and to the right and align it on either side to kind of clarify the way the text flows.
Awesome. And if you had more time, would you change anything?
Yeah, I would choose a different font for the title. And then leave it bold. But yeah, I'd probably play around with font size a little bit more, and then just the title.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Josh. So what I love about this is you went ahead and made the title and the author very clear. So as I'm looking at this for the first time, I see that referring to Green Eggs and Ham, it's by Dr. Seuss. And then as I continue to scroll down the page, what's happening is when I'm looking at it, my eyes are going from, you know, this first paragraph down to here, then here and here. And if we take a look at this, we start to notice that there's a lot of negative space that appears, you know, at the end of this paragraph, in the beginning here, and at the end here. And also, if we were to, this is what I was referencing earlier, another way to see what's really apparent is if you were just to click on R and highlight over your page, and you can go ahead and just change this to a white fill. And if you were to add an effect, just change that drop shadow to, I believe, background blur. You might need to reduce the opacity, so you can just literally just tap. I think you could reduce this down. There we go. All right. We start to see what is really, really apparent. So I start to see that this is really clear. And then what I also start to see are all of these rectangles here. So let me lock this. So then I start to see this. I start to see this. I start to see this. And what actually happens is my eyes are now kind of going all over the place. And so what I would recommend is let's try to keep this invisible column. Can I duplicate this? Oh no, I locked it. All right, let me unlock this. Let's try to keep this invisible column. And what I mean by that is, there we go. let's say if we were to left align everything, it might make it a little bit easier to read just because now our eyes are reading from left to right. We're not going from this section all the way to the right-hand side, all the way to the left-hand side. And we have something that we're able to follow along if I were to create this invisible grid, or not this invisible grid, this invisible rectangle. So what are your thoughts on that, Josh?
Oh, that is really smart. I like that. It actually is a lot easier on the eyes when you compare it. So yeah, thanks.
Awesome. All right, thank you for being my volunteer. All right, so any questions with that before we move on to our guided project? Okay.
I did have a question because some of the texts are really weird because like when you click inside of it, the boxes they're in don't match the same. It's not very the same. Like if you were to click on that body, the first body, and you click on the second one, they're different.
Yeah.
And that was, to me, was my challenge on trying to get that centered. I couldn't really figure it out.
That is really great that you pointed that out, JP. So what I would recommend is these should be all the same size in terms of width. Mm-hmm. So let's say we wanted to make this like a 20 pixel margin. And let's say we were to add margins on both sides. I don't know if my math is right. Let's just pretend that's 20. What I would do is I would just extend this out. So right now we're at 335 as the width, and I would just select all of these and just make sure it's 335. And so that way there's consistency. And then that should help address that issue where there's different widths taking place.
That's a good way to do it. Thank you for that.
Sure. Other questions? Okay. Awesome. All right. So let us. Oh, awesome. So we're moving into our guided project. All right. So for our guided project, if you go back into the board where it says Intro to Typography, so we've just done this text exercise, text hierarchy exercise, and we're now going to move into our typographic scale. So go ahead, add a page, and feel free to copy and paste what's here. So I'll give you a little bit of a background. This first one here, these set of wireframes, like I mentioned earlier, were created by Brandon. And these are just wireframes, so they do not need to be high fidelity. We're going to focus on visual hierarchy tomorrow. So we're going to fix a lot of the things that are here related to like the button sizes, iconography, and what I really want to focus on today is just the typography. So you'll see there's a slight difference between the two. I muted the opacity for all of the icons just because I don't want our attention, I don't want us to get distracted by them. And based on our color lesson yesterday, I also adjusted it to be a dark gray. So here we can definitely see the difference between using just a pure black versus a darker gray that is going to be more subtle and less overwhelming to the user. So we'll work off of this, but I just wanted to give you the logic behind why it looks a little bit different. And then for tomorrow's lesson, we'll clean this all up and apply visual hierarchy principles, which will be really fun. All right. And for those of you that are following along, some of you might be working off of one screen, so it's like really difficult to go between Zoom and Figma. So if there's a way for you to split up your screen where you're just dragging your Figma board onto one part of your screen and Zoom in the other, it might be helpful to be able to see both. Okay. right. So everyone should have this copy and pasted. And what we'll be doing first is we're going to create a typographic scale for this Flutter chat app that we've been working on. And the reason why we want to create this typographic scale is because this is going to help with consistency across our designs. I know when I first started working in UX design, I wish I had these lessons about typography, and I wish I had lessons about how to create a typographic scale, because when it came to just working on side projects, I would just pick random font sizes. And when I look back at my work, there was no consistency, there was no thought process behind why I chose 32 pixels versus 16 pixels. And so by creating this typographic scale, I hope that it's going to create more cohesiveness for your work. Now, depending, again, where you end up, you might already have a style guide that has this spelled out for you. So yesterday we were looking at material design. They had their own design system where they already have spelled out, what their H1 is, their H2, the H3, what those individual sizes are. So you might not even need to worry about this in the future. But because we are all working on our Build Week project, I want to make sure that we're setting you all up for success and that you have something to fall back on when it comes to moving your lo-fi designs into hi-fi. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to tap A, and we're going to create we can go into paper and just select an A4. So same artboard size that we used yesterday. And we're just going to rename this. So to rename it, you can just click Command R, and you can just name it to typographic scale. And then what we'll do is let's take a look at Google Fonts again, and we're going to pick a font size that we feel will really represent our Flutter application. So thinking back to the color palette that we created yesterday, we were picking something that felt a little bit more professional. And if we go into Google Fonts, I am going to make the decision process a little bit easier for me. So I am going to look for something that is going to be a sans serif, so I can eliminate all these other categories. And I'll take a look and see what's available. And let's see if it's available here. There was one. Okay. So what I really actually like about Hebo, and you can use a different typeface if that's not available, but what I really like about Hebo is the X height is a little bit larger in comparison to some of the other typefaces. I do like the amount of spacing, the kerning in between these individual characters. They don't feel as wide in comparison to something like Carla. And if I were to click into Hebo, there's just enough styles for me to work off of. So I may not use everything that's here, and chances are you will not be working, in your typeface styles, you most likely will not be using every single style. But this is a good amount to work off of. So I have my regular font style. I have my bold if I were to think of headers. And then if I wanted to have something to draw a little less attention, maybe it's caption, I can use then. But this is a good set. And so what I would do is I would download this font, but hopefully you all, if you are using Figma, you have downloaded this local fonts with Figma where you are able to see all of the Google Web Fonts. You can just head right over back into your file, and and it should be available for you to use. So let's go ahead and add a title. So we're going to call this our typographic scale. And I'm going to adjust this to that Hebo typeface. All right. And we'll leave it as that. And then what we'll continue to do is we're going to start building out our scale, and I'm going to make it easy for you all. So rather than trying to think through, you know, what would work best, there is actually a scale that is used by, that is created by, let me just get the name, created by Mr. Brinkhurst and the Elements of Typographic Style. So there is a classic typographic scale that we can reference in order to create a more balanced design. And I'll go ahead and share this with you all. But I would say that this is a really, really good starting point to refer to. And there are many other tools that we can refer to when it comes to creating a scale, which if we have time, I'll show you. But for consistency and for simplicity, we can start with this. So when it comes to building out our scale, we are going to define it by using categories called H1, H2, H3, body, etc. And so oftentimes you'll see this in designs, in style guides. And basically these are just tags that are used in HTML that define the heading. So this is basically just telling the browser the importance of each tag. All right, so let's start with our first one. And actually, let me pause. Any questions so far that I can answer? Anything that I can repeat? Okay. All right, so we're going to create our first one. So based off of this classic typographic scale, we can start with this first font size at 72. And so what I would do is I would just create a label, 72 pixels. I would classify this as a H1. I'm going to go ahead and just adjust the fill. All right. And maybe I'll make this a little bit lighter. All right, so we'll work with that. And then what I would do next is, in order to understand what this looks like, we are, again, using that typeface Hebo. So we would type out Hebo, and we can just change this to a font size of 72. Then we're going to continue with our scale. So the next one down is 60. So I'm just copying, holding down Option, and dragging this down. And so our next one, I said 60, right? All right, so we have 60. That can be our H2. And we'll adjust this to 60. And then we'll just continue down the same path. Next one being 48. And so we'll continue 48, 36, 30, 24. And you can probably just stop at 14 for now. So let's continue to build this. So we have our 48. This can be our H3 or heading 3. $36. be our H4. $30. That are each 5. And then we can add a few more. So next one we have 24, be our H6. And then we have, let's do 21, 18, 16, and 14. Okay. '21 or H7. '18. That could be our body text. All right. Make this artboard a little bit bigger. And then we'll do 16. That could be our body too. And then we have our 14. Maybe our 14 can be our caption. All right, how is everyone doing so far?
I had a few questions though.
Yeah.
Okay, so suppose if you are using 2 different types of fonts, you're supposed to create this for both of them?
Yes.
Okay. Second question, how do you decide, like over here it says heading and body and caption, but on a website, how does that relate to like what is a tab? What's the text in a tab or a menu option called? What are those called?
Yeah, so you would just use what we have already built out. So maybe in your tab, instead of having something that's listed as a tab, you would use something, and I'm just throwing out like an arbitrary number here, you would just use an H6. So you wouldn't necessarily have to build out like a separate, you wouldn't necessarily have to define what those are. You would just use what's already been created here.
I see. Okay, cool, thanks.
Sure. Great questions. Other questions? So I'm just cleaning this up, and I'll continue to clean it up after our lesson. All right, so once we have all this set, we can move on and create our styles. As we noticed earlier in Google Fonts, they had different styles like bold, thin, and what we'll do next is we can create our font weights. And we'll have light, we'll have regular, and we'll have bold. And we can go ahead and create what that would look like. So for Hebo, if we were to click on this drop-down menu, we would have what it would look like light. Then we have regular. And then we have bold. And so what we've done here Oh, was there a question?
Yes, just a really quick one. So, so for example, in Hebrew, all you see are H's and E's and B's and O's. What if the name is just too short? Is it sensible to maybe include a sentence that might showcase all of the letters?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay.
So I like where your head's going with that. So another thing that you can do is there's this sentence called "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog." Let me write it here so there's enough room. And what this does is it shows every single alphabet. And so that way you're able to see what it looks like according to each size. And so that might be an alternative. Rather than writing out the typeface, you could just list out this entire sentence for each size.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Okay. So, given that this is a pretty simplistic way to create a scale. And what I would encourage you all to do is, just because all of this is available does not mean that we need to use every single font size. When you look at your mockups, you'll see what is going to work and what is not going to work. There may be instances where you'll never use light. There might be an instance where you're never using 72 pixels. So just because we have all of this here, again, similar to your color palette, does not mean that you need to use every single style or size that appears. All right, so before we move on to the next piece, any questions about creating this typographic scale here?
Okay, just one more question. Is there a way to create maybe shortcuts to these? Like, for example, if I decide I'm only going to use like 3 of those font sizes in different parts, so in different parts of my web design, is there like a really quick way to just apply those rather than me sort of sorting through them?
Yeah, yes. And I'm going to show you how to do that.
Okay. Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. So just like how we created symbols or shortcuts for our color palettes, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing for the scale. And it's basically the same process that we went through yesterday. So once you've created your scale, you would just go ahead and select each one here. So I've selected the 72 pixel, and I will go into the inspector tool where it says text and click on these little 4 dots, this quadrant. Then what I would do is you can see that we already have one particular text style, which is Material Designs theme kit, but we're going to go ahead and create our own. So by clicking on the 4 dots, you're going to click on the plus button, which is going to create a new style. And you can label this as you want, but I will just call this as H1, and I'm going to label it with the typeface Hebo. Then I will just continue. So I'm going to click on the second, click on, add an extra one. So it's going to be H2, and then I would just continue down and add them. And so that way, as we're pulling our text, we'll be able to use them instead of just trying to manually add them. And I know there are a few duplicates because we're all doing this, which is totally okay. So don't worry, you can practice with me. So we'll just continue adding them. This H6, H7, and I'm sure there is a shortcut in doing this. I'll have to discover and share it with you all. Body 2. there's a caption already. Caption. And then I will add the bold. Okay. Questions?
Yes, please. Okay, so is there another way where, suppose if I've decided I'm going to use Hebo 18 bold color yellow for a certain tab, can I customize all of that into just one?
Yes. So
Okay.
what you could do is, let's make this like a really dark yellow. So let's say we're using body 2, you could just add this in. So what you, actually, let me preface with this. Once you have set this as a text style, it is going to be linked to that specific text style. So if I were to duplicate this like I did here, it's still attached to a specific style. So you can just unlink it by clicking on this little chain link here. So once you've unlinked it, you could go back and add another style. And so maybe this one is called body 2 yellow. And then that way you'll have that available. So if I were to update this, I could go in, click on body 2. Oh, that didn't work. Theoretically, you should be able to, let's see, if I were to add some text, unlink it, and if I were to click on body 2 yellow, it should change, and I don't know why it's not. So rather than trying to figure it out right now, let me get back to you on that, but you should be able to update the style.
All right, thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Okay, we'll look at this when we have some time. All right, other questions about the scale or creating this text style here? All right, and if you wanted to go in, so let's say here we have tons of duplicates. We can go and click into our styles. You can click on this edit button, and you should be able to go in and delete it. Okay, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. This is not the same way as how Sketch is set up. Okay, so we'll talk more about that and erasing. Cool. Okay, in any case, let's move on to the next piece. So we'll take a look at this here. And as you can see, there's various amount of different types of font sizes that were chosen. Maybe they were intentional. I'm not sure because I wasn't part of that lesson. But we have 28 here. We have 20. We have 32. We have 18. We have 14. And I believe these also follow. We have 20. We have 16. All right, so we have various different sizes that we're using. And so first step would kind of just be thinking about them in categories. So for instance, we have our header here, and it's good just to take a step back and think about, well, what size would I want my font size to be for the header? Currently, it's at 32, but if we were to look at our scale, maybe 30 might be a better number for that. So I would go into highlight that specific text, and our 30 pixels is an H5, and I can go in and update that and see what it looks like. So if I were to click into these other ones as well, and if I were to update it to an H5, maybe it looks something like this. So we'll leave it leave it like that for now. There are some spacing pieces that we need to work through. I will get to that tomorrow. So the sole focus is to just make sure that we have an understanding of how this is going to feel more cohesive once we have a style. Okay. All right. Then what we can also take a look at, so with the group name and recent message, right now our group name is at 18, and we have the text, which is 14. Maybe we could start exploring, and let's see what it looks like if we were to make this 24. So change this to an H6. And then if we take a look, we have the header at H6, so maybe we'll want to use body text. So let's take a look and see what it looks like as using body. And maybe we have something like this. And so if we were to duplicate that across, it's not gonna work. Let's see. There we go. All right, so I just, in case you're wondering what I've just done, I highlighted over the entire group, all of these elements. I held down Option and dragged, and then I clicked on Command D, and it actually created a row for me. So maybe we have something that looks like that, and maybe we can apply the same sizing with our username and message, because we are essentially using the same style. It's just going to be different information. So I'm going to copy and paste that here. And this was actually username. So what I should have done in hindsight is actually create a symbol. We'll talk more about that along the next few weeks. But this is not the way to update things. There's a much faster way. All right. So once that's updated, maybe we can take a look at the menu items. So to maintain consistency, right now we're using H5 in the header here. Maybe we can continue to use H5 here. And then for consistency, we're using an H6. So maybe these menu items can all be H6s as well. And I am going to erase this because this is basically this, but with a keyboard. All right. So if we take a look at the difference between our before and after, and I would recommend, we are always iterating on our design. So when you are working on something, do not erase your old version. Your old versions are good to keep. You never know when you're going to need to use them to showcase in your UX portfolio. You also may find, months down the line that you worked on something that wasn't usable, but it's actually applicable to another project that you're working on. So never throw away your work, and make sure you have copies of everything. So if we take a look at our before and after, what are some things that we notice? I'll leave it open to the group.
The legibility is higher for one thing. Like even when you're zoomed out, I can read like the group name versus in the old version, it's just a little black blob.
Yes. Great, Kelsey. Anything else?
Now, with a lighter logo like that, it doesn't distract from the actual text or the name of the people below that.
I'm sorry, what was the first part to that? I missed it.
So with the lighter logos, I can actually see the group name or the username a little bit better, focusing on the text instead of the little profile picture.
Yes, Ivan. Yes. And so even though our lesson today, so tomorrow we'll focus on visual hierarchy, so we'll talk about this, but I'm glad that you noticed it. So yes, this actually took away some of that extra noise. So really wanted to focus on the typeface here. Cool. All right. So,
Sorry, one question.
Sure.
In the home page where it says group name, you know how you copied and pasted?
Yes.
Is it just me, or is it kind of slanted and getting smaller? I always notice this, but it's just slanted on the side. It happens to me all the time. But is anyone else seeing this, or is it just the way I see things?
Do you want to share your screen so we can take a look?
Actually, no, I haven't actually done.
Okay. Okay.
But I just see, like, if I know, like at the end, the name, if you draw like a straight line from group name, the first one down to the bottom, I feel like it's not even.
So this edge right here?
Yeah. I feel like the top one is like a little bit further.
Yeah, I hear ya. Okay.
Is that, or is this not happening? It's just my eyes. Oh, it's just my eyes. All right. I spent ages trying to fix this. All right. All right. Thank you.
No problem. And it has happened in the past. I've seen it in Sketch when I go in to duplicate, that it might just like create this crazy line and not go straight. So always just go in and double check with the spacing. And we're going to talk about spacing tomorrow. So this is not, this exercise is just focused on the typographic scale. So, but yeah, we'll talk more about that tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so we're getting close to time. Other questions that I can answer related to creating a typographic scale, any of the elements that we reviewed earlier today, anything based on this exercise that we just worked on. Okay, so you all have access to this. I might just do a little bit of cleanup just to make sure things are aligned. But if you have any questions, you can also go in and take a look at what I have set up here. All right, so switching gears over into our assignments. Your assignment is available in Training Kit. You go to Project and Intro to Typography. You are going to go to Google Fonts, and in a Google Doc, compare and contrast two different typefaces based on the elements of typography. Take a screenshot of the typefaces and add it to a Google Doc. And then next, you're going to pick a typeface for your Build Week project and build a typographic scale. You can take a screenshot or post a link to the typographic scale and add it to the Google Doc. And as a stretch goal, you can go ahead and update your Build Week wireframes with this new typeface. Also, as a reminder, make sure that you're following the writing guide. And if we switch over to our rubric, at minimum, for a 2, you compare and contrast two typefaces that you, is there consistent? Yes, okay. That you are building out a typographic scale, and that your students, the submission itself follows along the submission format. What questions do we have about the assignment?
Yeah, are we selecting so the two that we're comparing, the two typefaces, one of those will be the one that we're choosing for our like Build Week project, or I don't know.
Up to you. It does not have to be yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying.
So just two that we like, right?
Yeah, just 2. Yep. And then to the second piece, pick a typeface that you'll be using for your Build Week project and building out a scale for that.
Okay, which is different than the 2 that we chose?
It can be different, or it could be one of the ones that you compared and contrast. It's totally fine. Other questions on the assignment? Okay. All right. We have 1 minute left. I want to make sure that we're continuing on with this daily feedback. And I am going to bring up Slack. And where are we? Here we go. All right, Vivian, tell me what you love and what you would change on your mock-up here. Uh-oh, I think we're having a hard time hearing you.
All right, is that better?
Oh, so much better. Awesome, we can hear you.
I don't know. I think what I love about it is that it's just clean, you know, and but the colors are very bright and you can clearly see where you need to go in order to monitor your cameras. I obviously forgot to change my titles on my rooms. I'm like, I have a pool in my living room, but whatever. But I think I would change the "Welcome Home, Mr. Stardust" that I have there. And also, I would change that to make that a little. I don't like the font, and I don't like the weight of the font there. And I also don't like where the font or the weight of the font or colors of the fonts for the login and settings. So after I looked at them, I was like, ew, I hate that. I want to change all of that. So
Awesome. Thank you, Vivian. So I would agree with you. I would look into a different typeface and color. I would say that for some of the text that I see here, like setting and login, there's almost sort of this outline and drop shadow, which can be a little distracting at first when you see it. So just picking a typeface and maybe just keeping it the way it is and playing around with the contrast will be helpful. And then I would say the second thing is there's a lot when I'm looking at this for the first time, my eyes kind of go you know, from the login to the settings to welcome home to the living room, or all these different sections, these beautiful sections of the home, and then the background. So what?
Right.
Yeah, so I would recommend for those of you, and not just Vivian, that are exploring having images or text over images, try seeing what it would look like if we just kept this to either like a lighter background or maybe just a single, maybe it could just be a colored background, because what's happening is I'm noticing all of this when I should be noticing all of this. And so I would explore what that could look like.
For sure, yeah, I agree with that 100%. Also, I like to point out to everybody that I said font like 800 times when I meant to say typeface, so that's going to be a challenge for me.
That is totally fine. I was looking at the in-class challenge and I wrote font instead of typeface, and I was like, oh, that's too late to correct. So we're all guilty of it. No problem. All right, awesome. So we're 3 minutes over. Vivian, thank you so much for letting me showcase your work, and I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.